join us as they can. So welcome everybody to this little lunch, and thank you very much to Arts Front for hosting us today. We're going to just start by just a little bit of housekeeping. And that's just to let you know that our lunch today is 30 minutes. It's being recorded and streamed live. So it's available for you to share with others in your networks afterwards on the Little Lunch Online website. Please keep your computers muted when you're not speaking, and please introduce yourself in the chat function by letting us know, who you represent and what country you're coming from, both in terms of, if you do have a migrant background, where you've come from, and also what Indigenous country you're coming from, you're physically living in at the moment. We have captioning, thank you very much, and also Auslan interpreters. And I think at this stage, everybody knows how that works. So please make use of those functions if they are useful to you. Let's begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we all meet, which is many and varied in this format, and pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And we recognise that sovereignty has never been ceded. Today is a first of a two-part conversation that we are keen to have with some fabulous cultural leaders in Australia who hail from the same location as I do, and that is Latin America. We have I'm going to invite you to get to know these individuals a bit more by clicking on their profiles on the Arts Front page. But let me very quickly introduce you to Pilar Casat, who is a long-term friend and collaborator of mine, who is currently based in Perth but hails from Chile. And we've invited Pilar along to this conversation today to really hear about her cutting edge research as part of her PhD studies around the role of CCD practice in advancing some of our social equity and cultural equity agendas in this country. So welcome, Pilar.
Thank you.
We also have Eyal with us, who is Melburnian, like me. So we are suffering the freezing cold at the moment. He is the managing director of the Boîte, and for those of you who've been around the sector for a long time, you know that it has been an incredible force in bringing diverse artists to the public realm. And Eyal hails also from Latin America, and I'm going to get Eyal to introduce a little bit about his own background and also the work that the Boîte has been doing, which has been just so phenomenal, not just in terms of identifying and platforming talent, but really shaking up the sector in terms of what it's failing to do by really looking at really interesting and different ways of connecting artists to networks. They've got a really terrific platform at the moment that they have been streaming called This Connected, and I really encourage you to get connected to the Boîte and particularly this program. So we're also joined by our wonderful co-host Priya Srinivasa, who you will all know because she and I have been co-hosting these sessions for a while now. And I'm going to hand over to her to really lead this session. We're exploring the role that Latin American artists and cultural leaders bring to our work here in Australia, and how we might better engage with this community as a community of artistic practitioners with a really long history of work here and, of course, from in their home countries. So over to you, Priya.
Thanks, Veronica. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I also, as always, acknowledge the gods, the goddesses, the spirits, and the elders from my culture who are here with me. I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and we exist on stolen land. As Veronica's already said, we have been doing this series for quite a while. And you can see my son, he's got the day off today. What is it, Rashid? Okay. school gave them a day off, so we're trying to balance a lot of things this morning. So it's a bit of luck that I'm here at the moment. Anyway, I'm so happy that we're finally in conversation with you, Pilar and Eyal. We've been talking about this for such a long time, and we're just so excited to have this. Hold on a second. Chrissy, can you just give me, we're live streaming. Can you stop? Thank you. Chargers, mobile devices. I tell you, I'm like juggling. Okay, so Pilar and Eyal, really excited to have you here, particularly what we thought Veronica and I were thinking today that we wanted to try and do is to look at these questions of the situation we're in now, the crisis, and how is it that you, Pilar, from your perspective, your research and the PhD that you just basically submitted?
No,
I
wish.
Presented.
I'm still working on it, but anyway. Yep.
Yes, well, very close. What your perspectives are on a couple of things. We'd like to hear from you first, and then Eyal after that, and Veronica, to look at, first of all, how you, all three of you, are seeing what the status quo has been in terms of attention to diversity, attention to equity before the crisis, and how we can look at moving forward from the crisis, not going back to what was before, but actually to really account for how we can use this pausa to really affect systemic change. And what do you think from your work that you could offer us to think about this question a little bit more deeply?
Okay, thanks everyone. I am on Nyunga Whadjuk country, and this land was not ceded. So as you said, we are on stolen land. Thanks a lot for the invitation. Firstly, look, I will just begin by saying something in Spanish, which I will translate. Aquí en la soledad prospera su rebeldía. That means here in solitude, her rebelliousness prospers. This is something that was said by Gloria Anzaldúa in a book called The New Mestiza. And these words have been resonating with me, the idea that we are in a solitude time, that we've been not only isolated, but cut off in many ways from the possibility even to be with our families. In my case, obviously I can't go back home, all my family are there. The idea that we take this time to cultivate a position from where we can speak from and cultivate a different way of thinking. And I guess this is the premise of my research continues to point to this idea of standpoints. How do we not only cultivate a standpoint to think about differently, but to begin to act differently in the world? Look, this idea of diversity, I think about this idea of that we talk about diversity. We talk about diversity in opposition to something else, or in the context of something else, and that something else. It's got to be a Western monolithic way of thinking, because there is no other way. I mean, we contrast this idea of diversity versus what? Versus, you know, a much more monolithic way of thinking about things. But where Latin America has got a lot to offer at the moment. There's been so many incredible thinkers and a lot of activism and a lot of art, activist art, that is emerging from the context of Latin America. And what people are saying is diversity is infinite. Diversity is what exists. And this idea that there are many worlds to think about, we need to stop thinking that this monolithic way of it's the only way and there's one world. There are many worlds. So my contribution right now is to affirm our different positionings, our different ways of thinking about, and different ways of beginning to act in the world, knowing that diversity is the universal point. It's not something separate that sits on the side. And in the context of the arts, obviously creativity is inherently new and new. It's inherently diverse. So it's even more wonderful to be thinking about in the arts is whether we can really enact this idea of diversity being pluriverse. I talk about this idea of many worlds, which comes from the Zapatistas in Mexico. This idea that, you know, a world in which many worlds can coexist.
Fantastic. Thank you for starting us off. I have lots of things to say, and I think today's not going to cover even a little glimmer of that. But I would like to pass it over to Eyal to see Eyal's thinking around this question about the past and how do we move forward from his perspective in the institution that he's in and leading.
Yes, hi Priya and everybody. I'm very grateful, first of all, to the Wurundjeri people for allowing me to work and play on their land in freedom and safety, and to all of you guys for inviting me to join you today. Well, I think one thing that always springs to my mind when the question of diversity arises is how incidental and almost irrelevant is the place where I was born. Particularly in comparison to the journey that life can be. You know, for me, I was born in Venezuela, but the real sense of feeling that diversity lives inside me comes much more from the fact that I've lived in 7 different cities, and that everywhere I go, I sort of add this new set of values and experiences that are totally different from one place to another, not by virtue of a political border, but by virtue of people being just ingenuous in different ways. And I mean, I think recognizing the power that our journey offers and what we add every time we move and what we contribute to the place where we are because we have been in other places and we have expanded our horizons is really what's been missing in so many ways. There's this, I think what Pilar was talking about, this one culture, one monolith, is really a narrow-minded view that it doesn't really matter whatever you bring with you, you can leave behind the moment you're here, because we are here living in the real reality, and the past is just this fluff in your in your existence that interferes with blending in. And I think, I mean, that's really the big challenge, is bringing difference, human difference, and the values and approaches that are totally different to the front, and saying, well, here is a valuable contribution to how we live our lives. And I mean, I don't know if we want to go too deep into how the dynamics are playing up now that this isolation conditions are driving us to experiment with things that, you know, are not that novel. Then the internet has been there for a couple of decades now, but all of a sudden the internet has become this boundless landscape where anything can happen. And I mean, I think this monolith that exists around us has always thought of itself, like prides itself on the local opportunities it creates, but all of a sudden this relative isolation has really engaged us globally, and it's no longer about local opportunities, but opportunities as a whole. And we're suddenly recognizing that the migrant artists, you know, the Melbourne-born, you know, the Northcote-born artist that has had all these opportunities, access to all these opportunities in advantage to the migrant until now, their life is really disrupted in some ways, but their friends are still in Northcote and in Brunswick. But for us, the migrants, all of a sudden, we are able to connect with people on the other side of the world, and the power that comes with that, you know, the availability of these networks that the dominant culture doesn't really have and doesn't really value. They never even thought they were important. All of a sudden, it's it's impossible for anyone that hasn't been a migrant and that hasn't had a journey like this to contribute in this incredible way. And I think that's the sharpest idea that is coming out of this situation for me.
That's great, Eyal. Thank you so much. It's such a great thinking through about you looking at migrant experience as the base to perhaps reimagine what the future could look like, with creating networks that are all over the world and not just in your local neighborhood. Something we all exist with, but it's really been exacerbated now and really brought to light. And also going back to Pilar's idea of the pluriverse, how might we reimagine moving forward a pluriverse with these fabulous global networks? And I'd like to get Veronica, also in her capacity as the CEO of MAV, to speak about how it is that cultural organizations and the running of it might be able to use institutional power differently to kickstart new ways of moving through this crisis and afterwards.
You know, it's interesting because I've been reflecting a lot on the subject of resilience. I've noticed that the term resilience appears, you've got your son in the background. I've got my daughter cooking in the kitchen, making a racket. It's kind of soft now. But I've been thinking about the kind of paradoxical nature of this time, the fact that we have, at the same time that we are being called upon to show tremendous resilience, we're also experience some of our greatest vulnerabilities. They coexist. These things in human nature, I think, coexist. We are never just always resilient or always vulnerable, but both things and many things at the same time. And there's something that I think that multicultural communities really understand deeply, that they draw from really enormous reserves of capacity and resilience, having experienced tremendous change within their lives, often associated with traumas, with deprivation, with hardship. But they also bring enormous assets, that those experiences are both you know, devastatingly real, but also the foundation of enormous strength. And I think that we are all, as a community now, tapping into some of those paradoxes. In a way, this experience is really humanizing, because although we don't experience the crisis in the same way, everyone is affected in some way. And I'm really keen to think about how we resist the notion that we should be seeking to go back to how things were. That in fact, actually, how things were was not particularly good for many people in our community, and that I think that the opportunity to reflect on what have we learned now is about saying, how do we create a new future that doesn't replicate some of these structures of the past, which keep people marginalized, disadvantaged, and away from opportunities. And part of that is recognizing that there are, you know, I think that we can learn a lot from multicultural communities, from diverse communities. We can really understand, you know, in a fulsome way, what they bring as to the experience of citizenship. And you know, I think that it would be really fantastic to take this moment to say that we reject the kind of this notion of you know, artists, multicultural artists, diverse artists, artists of color, as somehow framing some kind of deficit model where you know, we're constantly needing to develop them or provide opportunities. And in fact, actually, they have a lot to teach us. They have a lot that potentially can guide us through these experiences in a way that is a tremendous asset to us. And I'm really keen for us to draw a line in the sand and say, you know, we really reject these dichotomies of professional versus community art. The idea that, you know, that artists from these communities are always just emerging, and how do we use those kinds of institutional How do we use institutional power to really influence that discourse so that we're not going back to those things that have not served us well? And this is a moment where if we can take a stand and sort of reject those constructs, that we might actually have a glimpse of a different type of future in the arts.
That's great, Veronica. You've touched on so many points that are so important to look at. I was thinking while you were speaking as well, I've been talking to a lot of Sri Lankan artists who have come from war and trauma and who have said to me, you know, categorically that this moment is bringing back all that trauma and war and what they did to survive and how they coped. And I just was hearing some of them speak and I thought to myself, how amazing would it be to actually profile those voices, to actually look at what are these dancers, what do they say about coming through a time like that? And what is it bringing them now? I mean, because they're very clear. They're like, we don't need to dance right now. We don't need to perform in public. We don't need any of that. We actually just need to confront this crisis for what it is. And they've got the experience and they've got the knowledge. And, you know, someone from Feral has written, I don't know if it's you, Norm, or someone else, about how can we make the sorts of connections and dialogue that is happening now a part of our future. And that's also what I'm thinking. What are the ways that institutions can actually reimagine centering these alternate voices, not as token and not as the tick box for diversity, but actually rather thinking through bringing them from a place of strength and knowledge and power, similar to what First Nations artists have also been saying through this crisis, that this is not new. We are already coming from crisis. We live in crisis every day. Our lives are crisis. You've just joined us in a place where we continue to exist, right? So how is it that, Elliot's saying, you know, how can we make these networks useful and genuine? And I suppose I want to also come back to something Pilar said at the beginning, and also my knowledge or very little knowledge of your work, Pilar, so forgive me if I'm not getting this exact, but your idea of using art as social action, particularly framing feminist artistic practices at the core, and global South feminist practices at the core of change, at the core of leadership. If you could speak about that a little bit.
Yeah, look, thanks for that. And perhaps starting on what Veronica was saying, how do we do this? How we center these stories? I think it's absolutely essential that we reclaim those stories and create platforms for you and Eyal, that you run organizations, that the work is centered, so people have permission to center their realities and their knowledges, because I think those stories, different stories hold different knowledges, and this is where it's so important to recognize that the stories are not just stories. Stories are embedded in a different world, different reality, and different knowledges, and that's where the value is. Eyal, I'm not sure if I misunderstood you, but you said something about the past as if it's not that important. I'm not sure whether that was what you wanted to say, but I differ to that in the sense that all of our connections to our ancestral connections are really important, because it forms a trajectory. And in the feminist, particularly in the feminist global South feminism, the fight, if you like, the fight or the struggle is a struggle for affirmation and recognition of where we come from, and not just place, but the stories are embedded in our histories. So the more air we give to those stories, the more we can transmit the knowledge that we have. That's probably in essence, and the recognition that the struggles are embedded in consortiums of power that are against those stories. So it's not, the opposition, the oppression that comes in consortiums of power that tend to confabulate to silence those stories. So affirming our past and where we come from is really, really important. But maybe that wasn't what you were trying to say. So going back to, sorry, the feminist, and look, again, in Latin America, the most exciting thing that has happened in the last few months, in particular in Chile, there was the largest feminist march there ever in the world, just the 8th of March, just gone, where 2 million women in Chile came to voice their discontent, if you like, or more than voice their discontent, to own the streets and to have a presence on the streets. And it was just an incredible process. But this comes from, if you like, there is history behind these social movements in Latin America. This is not something that just happened overnight. Is there anything else that you want me to I'm just aware of the time.
That's really great. I was actually going to say, we've only got 5 more minutes.
Yeah.
And there's been a few questions on the chat that I've addressed already. But if there's anyone else who has any specific questions, we can address that now. But while I'm waiting for that, I also wondered if Eyal and Veronica and Pilar, if I gave you all 30 seconds to actually outline just a couple of dot points on what you think practically change might look like from your perspective and vantage point. Because I think you're all thinking very deeply and critically and putting it into practice in different ways. And I think it'd be very useful for us to have you on record in a way so we can return to this question as we move forward on some strategies on how we might think about the future. So anyone else has any questions? There's some great comments. Yeah, there's lots here on the chat. I might return to it in a minute from Melissa and also from Elliot. I'll return to it, but if I can just give 30 seconds to each of you, Eyal to start with, Veronica, and then Pilar, just to give us a couple of takeaways.
Well, can I just clarify that no, I did not mean that the past doesn't matter. I meant that in a dominant culture, it seems as though we're asked to sever our past and just face the local reality and then become Australians, but forget who we were and where else we've been.
Sorry.
So I do think that the future, in the immediate future, we're seeing that, you know, the idea of a new and emerging artist, which is so deeply linked to migrant artists, because it doesn't matter your track record back where you were before coming to Australia, all of a sudden it's all wiped and you become a newcomer and you're thrown back to the need to be helped group, like Veronica was saying. I think the future is really going to be reassessing what new and emerging is, and we're going to really recognize the value of everything you did before you landed in Australia and really elevate that to the place where it needs to be, which means you already have a powerful message and audiences and networks of people around you that in the current, the way things have been done here until now have been completely ignored. And now they're really going to be valued. I think, well, it's really up to us to elevate them to where they need to be.
Yes, fantastic. Veronica?
Well, you know, I think that we're losing we're losing public support for the arts in this country. And I think that it's because the arts in general are not true to who we are. And if we want to regain that support for arts and culture, we have to be honest and truthful, and we have to allow that to be an honest and truthful representation of our community. And I think that's the big awakening that needs to happen in the arts sector, that the only way that we will survive and thrive is through enormous public support for the arts. And therefore the arts needs to engage honestly with who we are as a nation, and stop reflecting this monoculture, this idea that we are you know, a monoculture. It needs to engage deeply with our First Nations history and our First Nations reality, and also our multicultural reality, in doing so, we will win the hearts and minds of the public, and we will have the types of support that makes the sector untouchable. But until we have that honest recounting, that honest reflection back to ourselves of who we are through our artistic and cultural products, we are not going to make it. That's my sense. And I think it's time we really took stock at the highest levels of the extent to which we are honestly reflecting our true nature to ourselves.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And Pilar, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I've got so many. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to say any. I'm going to be paralyzed by too many ideas.
We'll bring you back again, but you've got 30 seconds.
That's all right. Look, I agree with both of you. The idea to foster plurality is really fundamental, and so that we really can examine, if you like, the social histories and the histories of the communities. But that fostering plurality is probably the number one in my book. I think we need to be reframing this idea of what Veronica's saying to gain popularity, or if you like, the popular support for the arts. We've got a real problem with single authorship. We still value the idea of single authorship, and I think that's a real enemy in really opening up this idea that arts and culture is something that we do together. How do we collaborate when we only value single authorship? I think if we need to create new ways of thinking about this collective and creative collective creation. That's probably, I'll leave it.
Fantastic. What a great way to end. To think about collectivity and collective creation and co-creation. Beautiful and brilliant. And I just wanted to add that there's so many exciting comments and questions on the chat from Melissa and Elliot. So if you guys can, whoever wants to stay behind, perhaps we can continue this conversation with some of the questions that the chat group has brought up. But those of you that need to go, we'll say goodbye to you now and be back tomorrow with another great program. And I believe Caroline Bowditch is coming tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you. And just a reminder, please join us next week as we continue this conversation. We're also going to have a performance by Oscar Jimenez, as well as, digging deeper into some of these ideas. And I'd really like, for the group to have the opportunity to get to know the Boat's work much more. I think it's a really underestimated organisation that can have really huge impact in the sector. So perhaps next week, Eyal, you might take us through some of the work of the Boat.
For sure.
Yeah, great. All
Thank
right.
you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.